available. So if you happen to notice that I'm not recording, please feel free to let me know. Okay, so study steps, study strategies. This may differ depending on what topics you like, but try to study the more difficult topics first. You're going to want to have a set study schedule or plan, which can vary depending on how many courses you're doing. But have some sort of plan outlined to organize which topics you'll study when, and that will sometimes make it easier for you to plan accordingly, but also just to be more disciplined and stick with it. But try to preview material before class. So this one we somewhat have built into the schedule in this course, where we have the Mastering AMP due dates just before we start or finish a topic. So this is really helpful, and the science shows that this helps with deeper learning. So preview the material before we talk about it in class. Even if you just go over the slides, see what some of the terms may mean, look up some of the terms that you don't quite understand, and just have a general sense of what we're going to discuss and any preliminary questions you may have. Some of the more active study strategies: rewrite things in your own words, try to summarize concepts in your own words, try to teach it to a peer or a classmate. Charts can be helpful with this, tables, diagrams. A lot of the questions that you'll see will ask you to discriminate or differentiate between two different things, talk about how they're similar or different. And so being able to do this in your own words, but also just quickly reference your notes and compare to two different topics or structures will be helpful as well. Just have an easy way for you to study material often. It's not always easy to study the entire PowerPoint slides often, but have maybe a printout or a table or a chart that's a quick reference. Active recall and spaced repetition. So these are probably the two most powerful scientific methods as far as learning and memory. So you're going to want to actively try to remember concepts, actively try to remember facts. Or maybe explain how the processes, the steps involved in a reaction or anything like that. And then spaced repetition refers to coming back to it often. So if we study something this week, maybe you want to revisit it over the weekend, and again the following week, maybe 2-3 times before the actual exam. So spaced repetition, having an interval timing at which you review material, and then that active recall, trying to remember it on the spot, is what really helps to make material easier to remember, easier to recall. Teach or explain, like I mentioned this earlier, to your friends, to your peers, write things out, draw things out. You may sound a bit crazy if you're, alone in your room, talking to yourself, but trust me, this really helps, and it will help you unearth any misunderstandings that you have. So you may think that you understand the concept pretty well, but upon trying to explain it or trying to teach it to yourself, you come upon gaps where you can grasp that you don't quite understand it very well, and you may have to go back to the notes or to the text to clarify. So practice teaching, drawing. Concept maps are pretty good for this one, which is where you kind of illustrate how different topics or concepts are connected. And then lastly here, basically some of the in-class opportunities to practice: SI questions, checkpoint questions, polling questions, and then your weekly quizzes are just additional opportunities to recall, to test how well you understand these. I will typically go over checkpoint questions in class, where you will either share your response if you choose to, but more importantly, write a response in your notes. So when we go over checkpoint questions, I may call in a few of you to volunteer. You may or may not if you are not comfortable, but I would always encourage you to make sure that you're writing a response to each of the questions in your notes so that you can reference that back when you are studying. Same goes for polling questions. So typically I will launch a poll, and you'll be able to select a response, a multiple choice response. And you may feel uncomfortable if you don't know the answer. I will still encourage you to select an answer even if you're not sure, so that you can see how you perform, so that you can test yourself and then compare that to the rest of the class, and then probably your previous performance. Okay, now this last one is really applicable when you're taking the exam. And this is something I see students do quite often is switch your answers. So read your questions carefully, first of all. Make sure that you are clear about what's being asked. And if you're not, I always am open to clarification. So because our exams are on Zoom, I will typically take you to a separate breakout room and you can ask any type of clarifying question that you want so that you're clear on what's being asked and you can better answer. And then when you do select an answer, based on your reasoning or your thought, definitely try not to switch your answers, especially at the last minute, just before you submit. That will, or that has been shown that you're typically going to be shifting from the right answer to the wrong answer, just from the science on this. So try not to switch your answers, try to go with your gut. If you're not sure, convince yourself of one answer or the other and just stick to it. All right, first learning objective today is to describe the distribution of water in the body and define the different body fluid compartments. So essentially, we're going to talk about how water is divided in the body. We will first talk about the various body compartments, and then we will talk about where water is as far as those different compartments. So if we think about the human body, we can compare it to this minimalist drawing here, right? This minimalist body. And so while the proportions are off and the shapes are completely incorrect, this illustration gives us a good sense of where structures are in comparison from the external environment to the internal environment and how exchange happens across different surfaces. So in this scenario here, the external environment is everything in purple or blue, okay? That is considered external to your body, even if it's inside your body. For example, in the lungs, this area is purple. It's still going to be considered external environment, especially as it pertains to the air that's sitting in your lungs. It's not yet inside your physical tissues. Same thing is true for the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so the gastrointestinal tract here on the right is also shown in purple, which represents the external environment. So while it is a lumen that is inside your physical body, it's not actually inside your physical tissues, and this can be considered external, whereas the inner parts would be your actual tissues/cells. Same would be true for the urinary tract, and then obviously reproductive tract, although that's not shown here. The internal environment would be everything that's actually inside your body. Your blood vessels, which we can see here, your heart and lungs, your kidneys, your cells, your muscles, all of those structures that are actually within your body tissues would be considered the internal environment. And so there are two things we want to appreciate, is that the external and internal environment are separated by a membrane. Okay, this is called an epithelial membrane. All right, and this allows for separation, but it also allows for transport or exchange. So even though these two surfaces are separated, there is an opportunity for them to exchange materials, nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, which can freely move across some of these membranes. And we will talk about these membranes some more in membranes, which is chapter 4, but I want you to remember this now. This has to be a semi-permeable membrane. It has to be a membrane that allows for some things to go through when that time is appropriate, like oxygen, and then other things to not be able to go through. Large, bulky particles are not able to just cross these membranes, and so we would consider this a selectively permeable membrane. So let's describe some of the features of the internal environment. It is the immediate environment around most of our cells. It's going to include all of our tissues. So we know tissues are the large building blocks of our organ systems. They are comprised of cells. Interstitial fluid, which is the fluid around the tissues, as well as plasma, which is the fluid around the blood cells. So all of those various internal compartments that are immediately surrounded by our cells would be considered the internal environment. The external environment, on the other hand, is everything outside of the epithelia that forms these barriers. So the respiratory epithelia is forming the barrier between the lung tissue itself and the air that is sitting in the lungs. And so that is not only separating those two areas, but allowing for some exchange. Same thing is true for the gastrointestinal tract and urinary tract. Now, the external environment can be the food that's sitting in your GI tract, the urine that's sitting in your bladder or your urinary tract, or again, the air that's sitting in your lungs. Another important point to bring up about the external environment is this is the point of entrance of things like pathogens. So bacteria, viruses, fungi, they will usually use the external environment, right, because this is where they're found, and they will use this barrier as a point of entrance from the external environment to enter the internal environment. So this is why the lungs are a particularly susceptible area for infection or for the entrance of respiratory infections, especially during the cold and flu season. Same thing for the GI tract, right? It's an opportunity for pathogens to cross from the food that we're eating. This is how we can get food poisoning, for example, and then enter our tissues through that membrane. Okay, now, as we mentioned earlier, there must be exchange between these two areas. So for the purposes of nutrients to move into our body from the food that we're eating, oxygen to move into our tissues from the air that we breathe in, and then in the opposite direction, waste to be removed from the body. So the bulk waste in terms of feces or urine has to be able to leave the body, and so it has to be able to exchange from the internal environment in the opposite direction. Okay, so the areas where we see exchange are the lungs, the GI tract, the kidneys. The mechanism for that type of exchange will differ. So across the gastrointestinal tract, there is absorption and secretion. Can someone tell me in the chat, what direction do you think absorption is happening in? From where to where? Is it external to internal or internal to external? And the same for secretion. If you can put that in the chat, what direction do you think absorption happens in and secretion? All right, perfect. Yeah, so absorption would be external to internal. And then secretion would be internal to external. Perfect, thank you. So that is absolutely correct. The direction of movement is going to be in the opposite depending on what mechanism we're speaking about. So we can absorb nutrients from our food, but we can also secrete things like mucus onto the gastrointestinal tract, really just to help lubricate that tract, which will happen in the opposite direction. As far as the kidneys are concerned, the processes here are filtration. So filtration is movement of substances from the blood. So when we filter the blood across the glomerulus, which our instructors will talk about, that goes from internal to external. Reabsorption is a unique process to the kidneys. This is where substances that were inadvertently filtered are now reclaimed by the body. So this is happening in the opposite direction of filtration. So for example, glucose, amino acids, these are substances that should not be filtered out across the kidneys. And so they will be actively reabsorbed back into the blood. Lastly, secretion is just the same direction as filtration, which is going from internal environment, here the blood, out into the urinary tract. So the same direction for filtration and secretion, and then reabsorption would be reclaiming in the opposite direction. All right, everyone with me so far? Any questions on that portion? So basically how the body is organized and then the various processes and barriers as far as movement or exchange of substances. Okay, let's move on to speak about the water compartments. Now that we understand the internal environment and the external environment, we can then talk about how water is distributed across those compartments. So the body is divided into compartments that contain fluid, which are called our fluid compartments. And these are separated by those same epithelial membranes that we described. So again, these membranes are semi-permeable in that some things can go through and others cannot. So transport will occur across these membranes, and this is how we can exchange water from these various fluid compartments. So the first one that we want to introduce is called the total body water, also called TBW. So this is all the water in the body, all the water in the internal environment. Notice here, the lungs, the GI tract, the urinary tract are excluded from total body water. So this is all the water that is immediately surrounding your internal tissues and cells. This will also consist of any dissolved solutes that are in that water. So electrolytes like sodium, potassium that are dissolved or dissociated in that water. And then that is going to be dispersed all throughout your cells. That's going to be including water that's inside your cells, that's around your cells, that's inside your vessels. So this is a collective amount or a compartment as far as total body water. Now, inside that, we can think about two smaller compartments, intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid, ICF, and extracellular fluid, ECF. Now, intracellular fluid is just what it sounds like, all the water that is inside your cells. And so we know that the fluid part, right, you should remember this from our biology courses, but the fluid part of our cells is the cytoplasm or the cytosol. And so that water is considered intracellular fluid or the intracellular fluid compartment. The extracellular fluid is just the opposite. All of the water that is outside your cells. So it's in your total body water, but it's not actually inside your cells. So on the right here, we can see that all the water excluding that intracellular is going to be the ECF. Now the ECF is further subdivided, right? So things are going to get a little bit more complicated here. So extracellular fluid can be fluid that is in your plasma. And remember, plasma here is the watery component to your blood. So if you took your blood and squeezed all the cells out, right, the red blood cells or erythrocytes, that watery component that's left behind is called your plasma. And that is one of the subdivisions of your extracellular fluid compartment. The other subdivision of the ECF is the interstitial fluid. This is the fluid that is around your tissues. Okay, we'll talk about this some more, but this is the fluid that causes your limbs to swell. If you are standing or working in a standing job for a very long time, water will move from your tissue fluid, your interstitial fluid, and actually begin to pool in your lower limbs, and you'll get things like edema in your legs. So the interstitial fluid is the tissue fluid. It's the fluid that is not inside your cells, and it's also not in your blood vessels. It's not surrounding your erythrocytes, right? It's not a part of your plasma. And so it's all the rest of the fluid that is surrounding your tissues. So just to reiterate that here, we have, total body water, all the water in the internal body. We have intracellular and extracellular. And then among the intracellular, we further have the plasma, which is the watery part of your blood, and then the interstitial fluid, which is the tissue fluid. Okay. Now, this is the distribution chart as far as how much volume is contained within each of these fluid compartments. And I don't necessarily need you to remember or memorize these values, but what's more important is the trend or the overall proportions that we see. So total body water is 42 liters roughly, and these values are for a regular healthy male, right? These can vary greatly depending on your body habitus, right? If you're larger or smaller, if you are female versus male. They can also vary if you're a child, if you're pregnant, if you're elderly. So this is really just standard for an adult healthy male. So total body water, about 42 liters. ICF, about 28 liters, and then ECF, about 14 liters. Okay, so notice that ICF is a larger chunk of our total body water, in that most of the water in our body is actually sitting in our cells, right? So that's a really important connection to make. The other trend that we see is the ECF. So ECF is about 14 liters, and then within that, 3 liters is in the plasma and 11 liters is in the interstitial fluid. So another trend that we see here is that most of our extracellular fluid is actually sitting within the tissues, right? It's the interstitial fluid. So most of our body water is inside of our cells, and then most of our extracellular fluid is in the tissues, the interstitial fluid. Okay. Let's pause here and look at a few questions. Right, let's actually go back here. So what is the difference between absorption and reabsorption? What is the difference between absorption and reabsorption? So our second objective is to define homeostasis and explain its significance to the function of the body. So I began speaking about this when we met on Wednesday. Homeostasis is the core function of keeping our bodies alive. In fact, when we lose homeostasis, this is where we begin to introduce disease, right? Disease or pathology, okay? And so our bodies strive to maintain that constant environment. So the first sort of prompt question is, how does your body manage to keep your body temperature, your blood pH, your blood volume relatively constant day after day after day after day after day after day, right? For your entire lives at this point, which are a many number of days. How does your body do that? Quite a fascinating question, right? There's definitely some intelligent design in the body's ability to maintain these variables, okay? And so that's exactly what we mean when we talk about homeostasis. It's the body's ability to maintain a constant internal environment in the face of external changes. We know that the temperature of the air that's surrounding our body is continually fluctuating, okay? There's colder temperatures, warmer temperatures, heat, cold, right? And so how does our body strive to keep a constant internal temperature, even in the face of those external changes? And that is going to be homeostasis. So homeostasis is how we keep the body constant internally. The components or the variables that are regulated are going to be temperature, your blood volume, right? So how much blood, and so this is what I meant earlier when we talked about the distribution of water in those various fluid compartments. How much water is in your ICF versus your ECF? How much water is in your interstitial fluid? That should all be contained or maintained in a constant value, and this is what homeostasis is striving to do. Your body composition, right? How much fat versus muscle is distributed across your body? How much connective tissue, right? And so that, again, the body strives to maintain at a constant even in the face of change. And lastly, your blood pH. So how acidic or basic your blood is, the body strives to keep that fairly constant, even though we're eating acidic foods, we're eating basic foods, we're introducing different types of pH variations to our body, the body will still try to maintain a constant environment. Now, this requires a process called organ system integration. And what this means is that various systems are going to need to speak to each other or coordinate and work together to keep these variables the same. So the brain is going to be sort of the CEO in charge of some of these changes, but it will have to send signals to your heart or your blood vessels or your kidneys, right, or your lungs. And so this is what we mean by organ systems integration. Several body systems need to communicate and work together to keep these variables constant. And this is for two reasons. One is that we have to communicate the change. So let's say my body temperature spikes. That signal has to be sent to my brain, okay? Whatever thermoregulators will pick up that change or sensors, that has to be communicated to the brain, and the brain will decide on the change in order to return that variable to normal. So various systems help to bring about these changes or maintain these changes. The other piece here is that any disruption to homeostasis is the basis for disease and subsequently death. So any type of disruption to homeostasis, if your body temperature spikes and it gets too high, if you have a fever, right, especially in infants, this can be fatal. If the body temperature is, uncontrolled, if fevers are uncontrolled, this can result in death, especially again in infants. And then if we think about pH, if your pH becomes too acidic or too basic, that can lead you into metabolic shock, right? That can be fatal. And that's more of a drastic, more immediate change. But even if this is happening on a small scale, on a small basis, chronically, right, more long-term, that can also be the introduction of disease, more chronic diseases, and that can lead to death. So homeostasis is important at keeping our body constant, and then any disruption to that is the introduction of disease. And so this illustration, I always think is so powerful to show us an important feature of homeostasis is that it's never actually done, okay? So it's not the illustration on the left, and it's not the illustration on the right. The illustration on the left is sort of this perfect, pristine condition that's not changing. The illustration on the right is destruction, right? It's disease, it's death. And so homeostasis is neither of those two things. Homeostasis is the corrective process that we see in the middle that is striving to bring us back to the state on the left and prevent us from getting to the state on the right. And so I say that to say that homeostasis is never done, it's never achieved. It's a constant state of striving to keep our body in that internal environment. So while the body wants to keep the body temperature, for example, constant, my body temperature is going to vary throughout the day, okay? But it is the corrective measures that will help to bring it back to that standard temperature. Okay. Any final questions, guys? The next bit that I want to go into is a bit more of a detailed illustration. So we'll pick up class with that on Monday. And as a result, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up here, but I want to pause and see what questions we have. Any concerns, clarifications? Please feel free to share those here or now.